Welcome to the Best Kind Design podcast, where we believe that the best kind of spaces support your emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well being. Here we explore how the spaces we dwell make us well and unwell. Consulting accomplished experts that are doing fascinating work on the cutting edge of science and senses, I am your host, Sonia Randall, interior architect and owner of Best Kind. Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode where we are going to be chatting environmental psychology and interior design. I am thrilled to be chatting with our guest today, Dr. Sally Augustin, who is an environmental psychologist as well as the principal at the company Design with Science. Dr. Augustin has tremendous experience integrating science-based insights to develop recommendations for the design of spaces, objects, and services for the desired cognitive, emotional, and physical experiences. Dr. Augustin is a renowned speaker at events across the globe and has been discussed in many publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as design publications. She has written several books, including this one, Designology, which I will be chatting with her a little bit about today. I am excited to talk with her. Let's go. So thank you so much for being here today. I am excited to chat with you about all things environmental psychology and design.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So I'm going to dive in. First off, you have a very unique job. And for our listeners, I'd love it if you could just share a little bit about what you do and what type of clients you have.
Well, I am an environmental psychologist, so we're the people in the scientific world who think about how the world around you influences what goes on in your head. So I make design-related recommendations to people who are designing places and objects and services, and my client base is worldwide.
Love it. So in terms of how we use environmental psychology to create spaces, how would you say that we use it in a way that would facilitate optimal health and well-being?
Well, we're always getting information through all of our various sensory channels, and we can fine tune that in order to optimize people's mental and physical health. Probably the best known system for this is biophilic design, but there are a lot of things that neuroscientists have learned about optimizing people's mental and physical well-being that don't seem to fit under the biophilic design umbrella, at least based on our knowledge at the moment. So, we can pick colors that put people in the correct mood to succeed at whatever they're up to, which keeps stress levels down, which is good just, from a mental health perspective, just on the face of it, because stress levels are down, but lower stress levels also have physical ramifications. So we could, work through basically every aspect of our world, just as I've talked about color.
So in terms of, say, the key principles of environmental psychology. So if you were to walk into a home and say, a residential client hired you to walk in to give your perspective on how to create, a better environment for them, for their health and well-being, what are kind of the key things that you look for when you walk in to assess?
Well, it's important to know who the person or the people who will be using the house are. It's very useful to know things like their personality profiles, that kind of thing. But beyond that, I'm looking, I think about each of the sensory systems in turn. I also think about issues like people's need for control of their environment and that sort of thing. I once made a list, and there were something like, well, it was almost a couple hundred different aspects of the environment that I look at.
So in terms of, you mentioned just personality, because
Sure.
I
But
read.
also culture and stuff like that. There's a number of different things come into play.
Okay. So to talk about psychology for a minute, the
Sure.
psychology of types, I did look at, I read your book, Designology, which
Cool.
I loved, by the way, and I think that a lot of people can benefit from reading.
Well, thank you
And
very much.
yes, and you give this idea of place types.
Yeah,
And, you know, could you just give like a teaser of what they are and how knowing your place type can help to design a better home suited for your
sure.
needs?
Well, as opposed to getting into the names of all the different place types that can be hard for people to keep track of and things like that, it really turns out that there's three aspects of your personality that are particularly important in terms of fine-tuning a place for you, whether you're extroverted or introverted, how conscientious you are, and how open to experience you are. And when you think of people who score higher or lower on each of those attributes, you can identify these different place types altogether. And I'll just talk about one that doesn't get discussed as much. Some of us are much more open to different sorts of experiences than others. These people are more into sort of a novel experience versus a more traditional experience. And this is a core thing to know about people, because people who are open to experience not only might be more amenable to a different sort of color palette or something like that, but also they have a broad range of interests, which would be lovely to reflect in an interior environment. So there's quite a number of repercussions of people's positions on each of these personality factors.
Yes, I think I was an adventurer.
Well, there you go.
And that made complete sense. It definitely it resonated with me in terms
Oh,
of my,
excellent.
yes, definitely. So say if budgets are limited, what aspects of a space would you recommend for people to kind of prioritize for maximum impact when it comes to their spaces?
People tend to have dominant way of experiencing the world, and you can figure out what your dominant sort of sensory type is by thinking about a situation that was very positive for you, say as a child, and seeing if you think about the smells in the space where this experience was happening first, or visual elements or acoustic elements, etc. Most people can identify their dominant sense, and that's a good way to go. If you're creating a space for multiple people, you may need to think more broadly, depending on if, the assortment of multiple senses among the people who will use the space. In many situations, it can be handy to first think about ventilation, and with ventilation comes sense. For many people, sense are really a primordial experience tied into their experiences at the very most basic of levels. So that can be really important. And you want to think about ventilation in general in a space, because really when it gets down to it, none of the rest of it matters if your brain can't work because it's not getting the right assortment of oxygen. Thinking about sense can be a good, and ventilation can be a good way to begin. Next, if you're doing your own home, for example, you may want to think about what sort of messages you want to send out to people who visit your home. Do you want to convey that you're interested in this, or that your ancestors are from this country, or that you're like really stylish, or whatever? You think through, you have to have a sort of real honest moment with yourself and think about what you want people who come into your home to think about you first. And this can also be a handy reminder to you about things you value about yourself. So this can be really important. Something that people often focus on is clutter. And I suggest that people don't strip their homes back to something that's really bare. You want your home to be communicating, sending the messages you want sent about yourself. So that's how it happens to come up now when I'm thinking about nonverbal communications. So you want about as much going on visually in your home as is going on in a residential environment designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. There's actually a really gnarly equation that you can use to calculate the visual complexity of any sort of space, and nobody uses it after they finish their PhD. So, like, if you open a book to a residential interior designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and look at things like the number of colors, in the pictures that you see, the number of patterns, the number of objects on view, assortments of materials, etc. And then look around the place where you are that you're trying to assess, you can readily make the comparisons. And it sounds sort of silly before you actually try to do this, but when you actually sit down with, a picture online and you're in the space that you're trying to judge, you can readily make this comparison. So don't get overzealous and try to clear off all your tabletops and all your this and all your that. Leave a few things out because they will help you remember things that you value about yourself and help people who are visiting you learn about you.
I love that you bring up clutter. That's such an important one as a designer as well when working with clients. Is
Mhm.
there, in terms of the brain and this visual complexity and clutter, what impact does clutter have on your brain? Say if you walked into a space that's, like full of stuff, kind of hoard like, and then, down to that minimalist, say if there's nothing, what happens psychologically there?
Well, your real objective here is to have about as much going on around you now as was going on in the places where our ancestors were comfortable generations and generations and generations ago, like in our early days as a species. And we didn't develop as a species inside a clean white box, but as a species, we also always had to be very attuned to potential danger around us. So we needed to make sure we could spot danger in the world around us, and that's where this moderate level of visual complexity comes in. And this also, gets back to biophilic design, which we were starting to talk about just a moment ago.
Yes. No, I love that. And that, I think that that's helpful for people to know, just because, as you were saying, if we go back to our ancestors and the idea of being able to see predators, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm thinking that if there's too much clutter and you can't see, it could
Right.
have more of a cortisol, like stress
Oh,
response.
sure. Yeah, yeah. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Right.
Because basically you are stressed when visual complexity gets intense enough. So, that's not good.
No, and I'm glad that, this is a good segue because one of the things I wanted to touch on here is that, stress levels are really high and especially in the US now specifically. I've read that something like 30% of people will have an anxiety related disorder at one point in their life. So, as a designer, I feel like stress reduction in a lot of spaces is really important to incorporate into design. And I'd love to have your thoughts on how one would create environments that are more stress reducing.
Sure. Since many of us are visually dominant, why don't we start there? As it turns out, colors that are less saturated and lighter, say a sage green with lots of white mixed in, well, those are the sorts of colors that are relaxing to view, and so there are relaxing blues and greens and oranges and, any family except for red. Red tends to put us on alert because we learned to link it to situations that required very prompt action. Like we were bleeding, someone we cared about was bleeding, an animal we were trying to kill was bleeding, and we link those experiences to seeing red. We also are very comfortable, we're relaxed in spaces that feature curving shapes more than rectilinear ones. So, no pattern or place or whatever is ever entirely rectilinear or entirely curvilinear. So I'm talking about if you want to relax, feel really rested in the space, etc. You want a few relatively more curving lines than straight lines. And there are scents that you can introduce that will help you feel calmer and more relaxed. For example, the research in stringent laboratory research does show that we are more relaxed when we smell lavender, so that can be a really good smell to introduce in places where you'd like to feel more relaxed as mind softer textures. We can think in terms of lighting as well. Lighting that's a little dimmer, a little warmer is relaxing for us, especially when the bulbs being used to present this light are in floor lamps or in tabletop lamps as opposed to overhead. So there are a number of different sensory experiences that we can think about to make it more likely that we're going to be relaxed. But it is also important to point out that design is not magic. If you have just learned news that's very upsetting to you, you'll be wound up, you'll be tense, etc., no matter where you are, even if you've painted the walls just the right color, if the light is tuned just right, etc.
Right.
What's going on in your mind is combination of a number of factors, one of which is design.
Of course, yes. This isn't a magic trick. This isn't a way of treating disorders or even anything really that you have going on. We're speaking to it here, I think, more around just facilitating, helping your
Right.
body facilitate to induce certain feelings and emotions and mental states. But
Right, and there's a number of things you can do that you might not think of right away. For example, we have a lot more pleasant, productive conversations with people when we're sitting on a chair that even has a very slight cushion, as opposed to, like a hard wooden type surface. So if you're going to have to talk to somebody about something that might be stressful, make sure there's at least a slight cushion on those like kitchen chairs, whatever. Also, we tend to be more relaxed, get along better when we're in a recliner type chair. So if you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody and you happen to possess two recliners, try to lead people out in that direction. And it doesn't have to be a recliner like in the stereotypical
like lazy boy.
grandmother and grandfather living room, just something that, gets you reclined back a little bit, your feet off the floor, etc. That'll produce this effect. So like an Eames chair or whatever would have the same effect as that classic Barca lounger type recliner.
That makes sense. And, fun fact for listeners, that's why in a lot of coffee shops that you go into, they have hard seating, is because they don't want you to stick around
Right,
as
it's not as
long.
it's not as comfortable, that's for sure. And but
Exactly.
there is research that directly links sitting on seats with just even the slightest of cushions to like being more pleasant. For example, when you're negotiating with somebody, and you're just basically getting along better, being a better world citizen, shall we say, if you're sitting on something that's a little cushioned.
So that cushion, does it release a certain chemical in your brain or
Now, well,
no?
of course it would. Eventually, all your thoughts are chemicals, are chemically based. I think what's important for people to keep in mind is not like the name of the chemicals so much as just the fact that, if you wonder why your family is always sort of uptight when you're having conversations around the breakfast table, look around that breakfast table to see what kind of chairs you've got people sitting in. And even if you have chairs that don't have cushions, but that seem comfortable, well, add a cushion anyway, because it's the actual cushioning that seems to produce this effect.
Okay. Okay. That sounds, I mean, that's good. That's a good tip for listeners. So in terms of, mood and how spaces influence our mood, how would you approach, from an environmental psychologist perspective, designing a space to facilitate a better mood?
Well, something that people often don't think about is they get caught up, say, in what color to put on the walls and things like that. And obviously that, as we've been talking about, that makes a big difference. But the single most important thing to think about is what you need to accomplish in the space. Like if you are going to be doing work, and your work involves a laptop, you want to make sure that you can sit in comfort and you have a horizontal surface to put that laptop on, or you'll just be flummoxed right from the start. You don't want to have to be doing some clever balancing thing, while you're sitting in the overstuffed chair, but somehow typing on your laptop.
Right.
So the very first most important thing is to be really straightforward with yourself about what you need to accomplish in a space. Make sure you recognize that. and acting accordingly. And that's the very, very first thing I would do
So
in
like the
terms of creating
function.
a space.
So, right. Okay. So like the functional needs to be met first and foremost.
Right, or you'll always be in this weird position or something like that, which after not very long will make your back hurt or whatever, or you just won't be able to focus. Like, don't pretend that, if you need to be doing thoughtful work, that you can do that like in a corner of your living room. Well, like your kids are playing in another part of the living room.
Right.
Obviously, you have to be responsible if you have children and take care of them appropriately. I'm
Right.
not saying, shut yourself off and ignore your little kids, not saying that. But if you need to focus, to do your job, you can't become a super focuser, and like almost an imaginary creature, and block out what's going in another part of the room,
Right.
where you are. In that case, because you have to provide childcare, you're probably talking about doing different tasks at different times of the day. But sometimes people will think about, like, if their home has a very open floor plan, think that even without the complication of little children, they'll think that they can focus, do their do their job in just one corner of this open plan. And you have to be honest with yourself, because probably you can't if there are other people who are home when you're home.
Okay. So the space has been set up, like the floor plan has been tweaked, everything's kind of figured out in a way so that, you can operate throughout your day in a functional standpoint, and that's optimal. What would you then suggest to add to the space to kind of further facilitate like a better mood?
Well, sure, it depends on what your budget is, but let's just
Mhm.
assume you have a reasonable amount of money. So I won't suggest like you knock down all the walls and move them around. We'll just talk about things that are more moderately priced. The way we live in the modern world, you'll need to paint eventually. So you might as well paint with the kinds of colors that support the kind of mindset that you need, either not very saturated light colors. If you're going to be weightlifting, though, the color you look at, excuse me, the wall you look at while you're lifting the weights can be red, so sometimes you can have different functions in the space by just changing your view through the area, for example. So I would think about wall color. I would think about things like what kind of flooring is in the space. It's very stress reducing for us to see wood with visible grain, particularly if it has a warm finish. Often people have hardwood floors. Unfortunately, not everybody does, but often people do. So if you do, maybe you can figure out a way to maybe roll back your rugs some. Obviously you have to do this in a way that you do not trip over the rugs, but maybe, depending on what your space is like, maybe you can expose some of your existing hardwood floors, which is great. People also thrive in places with natural light, so you can think about your curtains. Depends on where you are, what floor, whatever. Maybe you have different privacy requirements, but at least have curtains that could be truly pulled to the side, at least some of the time, to flood your area with natural light. That's great. You'd want to be setting up your desk or whatever, your laptop, so that glare isn't a factor, but that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. So these things are pretty straightforward. You can be trading out your light bulbs also. Sooner or later, every light bulb burns out. So sooner or later, you have to buy more. So you can put those, you can actually think of zoning the light in your home, almost zoning it not by like living room versus dining room or whatever, so much as like vertically. So you can put warm bulbs in tabletop lamps, floor lamps, cool bulbs overhead, and just depend, or just turn on one set or another of your light, depending on what you're up to. It can create a weird effect if you turn on the warm lights at the same time with the cool lights. That can have a sort of murky feel. So, you have to be thoughtful about, your distribution of light bulbs. But like, eventually you're going to need new ones, so you might as well put them in the places where they have the most value to you.
So the lighting, the color, the wood grain, which I love that, by the way, of,
Yeah,
because people often think of the biophilia in terms of plants, which is
right.
obviously very good. But thinking about it in terms of wood grain, is it that your brain registers the grain more like a
Well,
real
they're
shape?
trying to figure out exactly, scientists are trying to figure out exactly what it is about the pattern of the grain. Mathematical analysis hasn't yielded like a set of equations that will produce wood grain the way fractal equations produce patterns in general that we find relaxing. Like clouds, actually, there's an equation that produces shapes like clouds. And it's a fractal equation, but we don't know the equation for wood grain yet. But I'm glad you brought up the plants because I was going to get to that. Plants are usually cost effective to add to a space, but maybe where you live really is dark, or maybe you travel a lot and your plants wouldn't be watered while you're traveling or whatever. Real is nice, but if real plants just don't work for you for some reason, you can add an artificial plant or two as long as it looks real. And you and I could probably spend, the next like all the rest of our time together delineating the features of an artificial plant that looks real. But we know when we think a plant looks real, like if you have to reach over and touch the plant to see if it's alive or not,
Yeah.
it'll make you feel better to have that plant in your home. So real is great and often cost effective, but if real just isn't going to work for you, do not despair. Go with a good fake plant, a fake plant that looks real, and you can just remember to dust them. Some people forget to dust their fake plants, and then uh, our minds will sort of rebel if it looks like we're trying to trick them somehow. So like if your plant builds up, if your fake plant builds up so much dust that if it was a real plant, it would be dead. Well, your brain will stop finding it relaxing to look at that plant. So like something I do,
Probably better for the respiratory system too.
yeah, there we go.
That's your plants.
Well, something I do every year around this time
Right.
is I actually take all my fake plants. Over the years, I've invested in a number of good-looking, shall we say, fake plants. I take them outside, I put them on my driveway, and I literally hose them down. It has to be a lovely day because I leave them outside till they're completely dry. So it's nicer if it's a, sunny 80-degree, low humidity day. And then I bring them back into my house, and that gets rid of the spider webs that might have built up at the back of the plants, over a little period of time, or dust, or whatever. They're really clean. They look really great. They look clean and great for about a year. And I take them outside again and hose them down again. So the point is, you don't have to water fake plants, but it's not like they're completely maintenance free. You do have to somehow deal with the dust.
It's a good tip. I like that. That's a good way for people to take care of their fake plants if they went that route. And for people that did want to go the real plant route but do travel, you can also have a service come by. If
Yes,
that's
that's right.
because
That's right.
that can be wonderful to just have someone come in and take care of your plants, and then
Yep.
they're healthy long term and they thrive. So
Right, and a lot of businesses, for example, don't even own their plants. They
yeah.
have services that actually own the plants. The services come in and water the plants, but they'll trade the plants out every so often to keep things looking good. So, as you say, there
Yeah.
are things that can be done, but if you decide you want to be self-sufficient, you can do that too.
Yes, I actually learned that from my commercial clients because we would do it in commercial spaces. And I was like, why aren't we doing this in residential? If you can, because that is a great solution, especially if you wanted to add color to your space via plants and vegetation.
And this
So, anyway,
will just change things out at different times of year, because
yes.
another things that humans like is for things to be a little different at one time a year than another. I think that's why in a way
Right.
why so many of us can get so into like Christmas trees because, you know, you add a Christmas tree to your home and it's clear it's not July, you know,
Right.
because, well, for most of us, it's clear it's not July because most of us do get the tree down. So, you know, it's gone by July. But, you know, and it doesn't have to be a Christmas tree. You can just like add some, you know, wreaths of greenery, you know, or boughs of greenery in your into your house at one time of the year, take them down at other times of the year, change the tablecloths or linens that people can see, you know, to be different sorts of colors at different times of the year, just because it shows, well, people like to know where they are time-wise. Makes us feel comfortable. When I first moved to California years ago, you know, like I'd be writing a check, for example, like if for whatever, and I would actually have to think like, is it January? Is it July? Because the weather was always the same, exactly the same outside. And that's sort of discombobulating to us as humans, you know. So having some variation in your home from season to season is great.
That's a great idea. And I especially like the idea of plants because it's a sustainable way of changing
Mhm.
things up in your space as opposed to like a fad, fashion of, in terms of interiors of changing things out frequently that is more detrimental to the environment. I think
And,
plants is a great way to go about it.
and particularly if you live in certain climates, like it could turn out that depending on where you live, that maybe plants that you normally have like on a balcony or a terrace or something like that just can't make it outside at certain times of the year, and you can bring them in, you know, during the time that they need it to be a little warmer or drier or whatever. And that changes up your house some, you know, they make it through the winter or summer or whatever, and then they can go back out to the balcony, you know, or the deck or wherever they were before, and your house is a little different again. So,
That's great. That's a great idea. So in terms of, because I know we talked about that wood grain and the calculations, and I love that. And I think for, our nerdy listeners, because there's definitely a lot of those as well. In terms of, are there any other natural materials other
right.
than wood that we know that has that nature kind of evoking feeling within us for a better mood, for reduced cortisol, all of those things?
Right. There's a whole range of natural things that will produce this effect. Stone will have this effect. Stone is heavy, so
Mhm.
you can be more restricted in terms of how you can actually use it in your house, your business, whatever. Wood is light, so it's relatively easy to like put wood paneling, say on a wall. You really have to think about engineering, putting stone on a wall. You don't ever want anything like that to fall on anybody, whatever. But I was talking about variation from time to time a moment ago, and we particularly enjoy seeing materials develop a patina over time. So, you know, copper develops a patina, leather also gracefully ages. So they can be great additions to your home as well, and they're natural.
I love that. So, for people that are looking, what, I'm hearing and what we're talking about here is that natural materials, or at least the reproduction of them in a way that's really convincing to your brain to evoke a feeling that it's real, is very good for our bodies in terms of mentally and emotionally to increase mood, to
Mhm.
potentially reduce stress. Are there any other psychological benefits?
Well, they might signal something to you that's important to you, like my sister got leather couches before her two sons were born, and the leather couches have held up. Both her boys are now through college, whatever, the couches made it.
Oh, wow.
Um, but that can signal like continuity in your life, you know, to have kept something around for a long time, or it might indicate something else to you, like you're good at planning ahead, for example. You know, the leather couches, the leather sofas might have been a little more expensive at the moment when my sister purchased them, but now since she's had them and they look good for basically 30 years, they've turned out to be a really cost-effective choice. So if
Right.
you like to think that you're good at budgeting and planning or whatever, that's the kind of message that you could get from, if you had used leather. So, that's what I was getting at a moment ago in terms of the messages you get from the things around you. You want to line them up with things that you think are good about yourself.
Right. I love that because, you know, um, I'm thinking, when you're saying it, I'm thinking you're basically creating a space that's more in alignment with who you are. You're creating a space that's more a representation of who you are. So you're not going to get tired of it. And especially if it's related to nature, and there's a
Right.
natural element because it's not, again, it's not like I just want to relate it to fashion because there are, I think people get it in that regard a lot where you might
Sure.
get staple timeless pieces that you have for decades or your mom had it and it still has that quality and you still use it. And then there's other things like you might like something for 3 months and then and then you let it go. So it's really good to know deep down like the things that resonate with you and your values, so then you're making more informed purchases and it's better for the environment.
And if you make science-informed choices also, you don't have to thrash around until you hit on the whatever that feels good. So like if you know about
Right.
color, saturation and brightness, you can sort of move towards the right color for your walls right away,
Right.
as opposed to painting them a weird or like painting them yellow and then painting them a vibrant green and then painting them a this and then painting them that before you actually settle on to the unsaturated blue that helps you relax and go to sleep in your bedroom. So
Right.
science informed can be the best choice for the planet as well.
That makes sense. Like it basically, an example of it would be if you're buying an ergonomic chair, you're going to want to look at the science behind the chair and what it's going to do exactly for you and have look at those options. Look at the options that actually align with science rather than, just thinking about the things that you are drawn to because they can sometimes not be 100% in alignment with you. So,
Right. I mean, for example, if people who have a high need for uniqueness could be particularly tempted to go with the chair that is unlike any other chair they've ever seen before, and might turn out that the reason you've never seen a chair like that before in anybody's home, et cetera, is because it's just profoundly uncomfortable. So sometimes you have to actually ask yourself what it is that's leading you to one choice or another and determine if that's really the way that you should go.
yes, that brings me back to your place types,
Yep.
in terms for, me as a designer and what I also recommend to others as an adventurer, I do it with plants. I do it with things that I'm able to sustainably kind of change
Right.
out to satisfy that part of who I am. So in terms of the future of environmental psychology and interior design, are there any new trends or anything that you have in terms of where you see the industry going, how you see it
Well,
on?
something that's happening in the research world is more simultaneous effects are being tested. At one point, people would do a study on color and just a study of color. Now there's more apt to be a study of color combined with textures that people feel as they're looking at the color, et cetera. So that's cool. We're getting a more comprehensive understanding of how we experience our world. Happily, most of us have multiple functioning sensory systems, and research now is probing more of them simultaneously. We're also, I mean, just plain learning more about the brain all the time. More and more studies are being done. We're getting a better understanding of things like how culture comes into play, how the language people are speaking comes into play, etc. So as more people enter the field, there's more research being done, which helps all of us understand our world and how we can best live in it.
I'd be interested to see more like if there's more studies around lighting and color and exactly how that
Oh
inter.
yeah, that there actually are whole journals that are devoted just to color and just to lighting.
Right.
A lot of them are very, very specialized. For example, if you're selling beef, what color and intensity of light should you shine on that beef to encourage sales. So that's what I mean by example of a very specialized study. There's more and more research as more people enter the world. There are more and more studies being done of all different types. There's quite a few specialized journals. There are conferences that people who are interested attend, and there are a lot of things that we can move out into the real world from these more academic areas that can help people lead better lives.
That's great. So is there any resources that you'd recommend to people to go to
Well,
and to learn more about how environmental psychology impacts them?
I publish something called Research Design Connections, which comes out once a month, that talks about recent studies that can be applied in practice, and it integrates those recent studies with previously published studies to give people a more comprehensive idea about how color can be used and things like that. But people can also go to places like scholar.google.com and do searches. You often have to learn the right terms, and you do have to always carefully look at who has posted whatever you're looking at to make sure that they seem impartial, and put
Right,
on your logic cap when you look at how
right.
a study is done to make sure that seems
Learning.
appropriate to
Yeah.
you. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, in the age of the internet, there's a lot of information that's readily available, just out there. You just have to learn to sort through it.
I noticed in your book you had talked about some of the differences between men and women. And I mean, you also talked culturally, but even just between men and women and how they experience spaces. Are there a few things that
Okay, well,
you
something that may settle some arguments out there is men and women have different acuity in terms of their sense of touch. And this comes into play because any human has the same number of nerve endings in their fingers, but men's hands, this is a generalization, men's
right,
hands tend to be bigger, so those nerve endings are a little further apart. Women's hands tend to be smaller, so the nerve endings are closer together. So if you were thinking about a commercial application of this, but it'll give you an idea how this can come into play. Say you had a chair that was in the waiting room of like a urology clinic, and which might be used primarily by men. So it's used there for years, no complaints. Life is peachy keen. But then for some reason, you decided to move the chair to a gynecological clinic where more women will be waiting. And maybe, after all those years of the chair really being fine, chairs really being fine, when they get to the gynecological clinic waiting area, people start to complain like that the arms are rough or something, whatever. And you might be like, what? What? Well, it turns out, as I was mentioning, men's sense of touch just isn't as acute as women's. It's been the same texture all along. Felt great, fine to men, not to women. I mean, another thing that comes into play is if you happen to be a couple with like a biological woman and a biological man, you really want to leave it up to that biological woman to determine if two color samples or whatever are the same shade, because biological women have better color vision than
Mm,
men, and a woman will be able to tell if, the old blue and the new blue can of paint or whatever are actually the same blue, where men's eyes do a better job at spotting and following motion. And this makes sense based on our really earliest days as a species. Men generally, often, whatever, were out hunting. They had to, see the buffalo or whatever, follow it, throw the spear at it. Like these are all stereotypes now, but whatever. They had to be able to deal with motion. So their eyes became particularly well attuned to seeing motion, dealing with motion. What were, again, this is a stereotype, what were the women doing? Well, these men were out throwing spears around or whatever. Women were looking at berries and things like that because they were harvesting plants often, and they had to know, for example, if something was ripe. So, it became very advantageous for women based on what they were likely to be doing to have good color vision, and men to have good vision that relates to seeing motion. So we're not, even beyond that, we don't all have the same sensory capabilities. People can have various levels of neurodiversity, or getting something that can be a little, it's not so potentially stress inducing to talk about. There are people who have a much better sense of direction than others. There are some people that you can march up to them on the street and say, which way is north? And they turn and they point accurately north, like every time you ask them. So
Right.
I just bring it up in terms of, you know, humans are pretty cool. We're really interesting puzzles, and we have different capabilities.
So that's great. So in terms of, I know we're a little over here, so I'll ask my final question. If you could snap your fingers and change one thing about how people approach the design of spaces globally, what would you change?
I would tell people to be true to themselves. Don't worry much what the trends are. I mean, if something you like is trendy and you have the money, you can do it comfortably, whatever, go buy whatever, and maybe even buy a little extra and stock it away, depending on what we're talking about. But if a trend doesn't appeal to you, if something makes you tense, you just don't like the colors involved, whatever, you don't have to reason it all out. If you just don't like it, don't do it. Be true to yourself and go with your gut.
I love that. That's fabulous. As I say to clients a lot, I think that there's a few, I mean, this is an, this is not a blanket statement, but there's often different types of designers. So if you're going to hire designers, you need to know what you're hiring.
That's a good point too.
Because you could be, because some designers you're hiring a look. You're literally hiring that look that you see that they are
Yeah,
advertising.
and they're really good at that look.
Right. And they're great. So make sure you love it. But
That's
then,
right.
but if you're looking for a designer that wants to bring you out into space, and maybe that has some elements of this designer, that designer, yourself, all of it,
Right.
that's a different type of designer. And so you just need to make sure that you're hiring someone that is on the same page with what you're looking to do.
And
Uh,
listens to you. Like if you
that's
say,
part of it. Exactly.
I don't like that blue,
Yes.
whatever, they move away from that blue. For example, that color blue that's Tiffany blue?
Mhm.
I had to take, when I was a little girl, very little, I used to get hives, allergies, hives. And my hot medicine for hives, my hives medicine, was that exact color of Tiffany blue. And when I see Tiffany blue now, I can still taste that awful taste of the hive medicine. And I do not wish to use Tiffany blue in my home. I do not wish to see it. There's many good things about this color. I would love to get presents in little Tiffany boxes. I think I could overcome that. I don't get those presents though. But be true to yourself. Like if
Yeah.
Tiffany blue is in and you had to take the same hive medicine when you were a child that I had to take,
Right.
just wait. Something else will be trendy in a few months or by next year. Just go with what feels good to you, and don't let yourself be carried away or manipulated by like a designer, like you were mentioning, who says, oh, that blue is the color you should have. You definitely have to have that. You have to do it.
Right.
Like stand up if yourself. If you don't like it, say it. Don't let
Right.
yourself be pushed.
Yes, because it's one of those things where you said, and I think it just comes crucially to when you're interviewing people, because you can't,
Right.
just like in your personal relationships, for most people, you can't change someone. So make sure you're hiring someone who wants to listen, and who's someone who wants to bring you out into space, who
Right.
it's about you. I mean, they're a translator. Like I said, some designers
Yes, that's right.
are translators, and
That's
some
right.
designers, they're an art. Some designers are like, this is my art, and I'm gonna, like, I want to put it wherever. And so you just need to know what you're looking for, and then realize you can't change people. So even if you love a design, if they're not a person that's going to listen to you, like you said, they're not going to listen to you.
Move on.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you,
Well,
Sal.
thank you. And I hope you have a good day.
You too. This was a great conversation, and I know people will learn a lot from it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's it for this episode. Please remember before you go to subscribe below. You can also check us out on Instagram at bestkind.design or our website at bestkind.design. Best Kind Design's interior services are also available for hire. So if you have a residential, commercial, or a hospitality project, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@bestkind.design. Until next time, be well.